Welcome to Means of Grace, a podcast produced by the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church.
Before we continue, I wanted to take a moment to share a few things that are happening around the Western North Carolina Conference. Bishop Ken Carter, resident bishop of the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church, has announced a leadership transition within the appointive cabinet. Beginning July 1st, 2026, Reverend David Hockett will be appointed as the Metro District Superintendent. Reverend Dr. Dan Pizzette, who has served as Metro District Superintendent since 2021, will return to local church ministry. Bishop Carter also invites clergy and lay leaders from across the conference to gather for the Bishop's Climate Summit for such a time as this, on April 18th from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. at Maple Springs UMC in Winston-Salem. This one-day summit will explore how the church can respond faithfully to the challenge of climate change through scripture, theology, and practical action in our local churches and communities. The day will include workshops for a variety of ministry leaders and a keynote from Reverend Dr. Melanie L. Harris of Wake Forest University. Registration is open through April 10th. Project Agape Sunday in the Western North Carolina Conference will be Sunday, April 26th. Per the conference, churches are asked to take an offering to support the ongoing ministry that began in 1994 and continues today. Support for our Christian brothers and sisters in Armenia is still needed, especially since the recent invasion by Azerbaijan, supported by Turkey, and the loss of their historic land of Artsakh. Monetary donations will be used to help the thousands of lives displaced by the 2020 war. And now, back to the episode.
Today, we are going to talk about anxiety. In the last couple of years especially, it seems that many, if not most people, are living with a pervasive and constant sense of anxiety on some level. There's many things that we can name that contribute to it in our communities and within the United Methodist Church. Living with and coming out of a pandemic and the lingering effects, differing ideologies and commitments of a political nature, the splintering in the UMC, and financial concerns, increasing prices, and an uncertainty about the economy, just to name a few. In this conversation, we will explore the nature of the anxiety people are experiencing and how we can be a neighbor, even when we can't fix the problems. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Reverend Catherine Sherrill, who is a United Methodist deacon and a therapist with Sanctuary Counseling Group. Hi, Catherine.
Hi.
Can you tell us a bit about your background and your ministry of therapy?
Yes, I am a lifelong Methodist. I actually grew up not far from our home of the Western North Carolina Conference, Davidson United Methodist Church. And I grew up really, really active in the life of the church and really was drawn from a very young age to music and to just the call of helping people and being there with people and community. And I was so passionate about this and also never really acknowledged for myself that a lot of this, sometimes I worried a lot about what people thought about me, what I was doing, if this was right, if this was wrong, trying to listen the best that I could to God's call. And you know what? For a lot of my, especially high school career, dealing with a lot of anxiety of keeping up with a lot of different things going on in my life. But I felt so pulled to helping people. And I went to Appalachian State University and did my bachelor's degree in music therapy. And from there, I worked for about 4 years in the medical setting as a music therapist, working with children with disabilities and in hospice. And this entire time, still feeling that pull of there's something more that I'm being called to do. And really defining for myself, a lot of that had to do with people with anxiety, much like myself. And I went to seminary at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary in Chicago, Illinois, and received my Master's of Arts in Clinical Pastoral Care and Counseling. After living in the Midwest for 6 years, I really needed to be back home where it's nice and much warmer, and really blessed to be able to join the staff at Sanctuary Counseling Group. I've been there now for over 2 years, and this was everything that I always wanted when I thought about my call, being able to partner in churches with churches for the mental health of our entire community, and being able to provide not only counseling to individuals, couples, and families, but also do mental health education with churches and with laity members, and being able to make this whole community, reduce the stigma of mental health, but also to promote the idea of whole wellness for us, an emotional and a spiritual level.
Thank you, Catherine. I hadn't really thought much about my own anxiety as a child until you just recently, until you just identified that. And I had a similar experience of, and maybe many of us did, but of just a lot of anxiety as a child. And it just reminds me of how important this is for people of all ages. I think sometimes we think about mental health as being a concern for adults, but more and more I hear stories about children and, of course, adolescents experiencing a variety of forms of anxiety and worry. And just in a staff meeting the other day here at the office, somebody mentioned that it felt like everybody she knows is overwhelmed and overworked and anxious. And in some ways, to me, it does feel like we're in a time that it's more pervasive, that it's just kind of a constant, whether it's really debilitating in people's lives or whether it's just more of a constant presence in people's lives. And I know of some people who have been hospitalized even recently over just a short period of time. I've been surprised by knowing about 4 different people being hospitalized just because of their anxiety. And so I wonder, as you're having conversations with clients, kind of what are you hearing and experiencing that is going on in people's lives right now that's creating and causing this anxiety?
There's a lot of different factors. The first one that comes to my mind is we are coming off and in some ways still in this pandemic time. And when we think about actually how anxiety works, I tell people, anxiety is a biological function. It is completely from fight, flight, or freeze. We've had this as long as humans have been created by God. This is something that God created in us. This ability to protect ourselves, to think about, okay, something unexpected or huge or potentially dangerous is coming up. What am I going to do about it? And the thing is that this is a pretty old system. It's not quite yet equipped for the world that it now finds itself in, which is in the time of the pandemic, everyone was, getting news. What's next? 2 weeks, 5 weeks, 3 months. And we're constantly re-triggering this system in our mind that says something's coming. Are you ready for it? Somatic therapy, we call this flipping our lid. Basically, that we're no longer operating from these really, really highly intelligent parts of the front of our brain or the sides of our brain. Instead, we're just going off of emotion, off of fear. And we can get really stuck there. Actually, over time, the more that we are introduced into stressful situations or into anxiety, structures in our brain can actually grow over time. We become more adaptable to anxiety, basically meaning we can take on more. So instead of ever lessening the amount of anxiety that we do, we almost feed a cycle into it. Instead of coming down, we add more. And this is really something that I'm seeing a lot, particularly in a young adult population of, I had this one thing happen, but then this thing happened, and then this, and then this, and then this. And it's almost this stacking effect. By the time I see them in counseling, we're trying to pull the dominoes now that have stacked up so much that it's almost impossible to get to that bottom one that started it all. And sometimes that was the pandemic. A lot of times it was even small factors before the pandemic. And this kind of almost domino effect now that we're seeing is, if we've lived with anxiety for so long, do we know how to live without it?
And even the results or the coming out of the pandemic and where the church is also very hard. And the pandemic might be something that at least we can sometimes say to ourselves, well, that happened, and surely in my lifetime that won't happen again. But where we are in the church is real, and it's in front of us and also ahead of us. And it's a kind of a source of anxiety on some days, and just figuring out what to do with that doesn't go away and doesn't stop existing. And that's probably one of those things that also kind of contributes to the ongoing underlying sense of anxiety.
Well, and I wonder too, and I had asked you, Kim, about some resources around, like, how do you grieve well when, like, someone in your church that you were counting on leaves? Because I feel like a big part of what I've learned from therapy is that, like, we need to take time to deal with the hurt and the pain. I don't know if we're doing that. And I wonder if, like, the pandemic caused us to do that less, if we were even doing it before, in that, like, it's that we have this mad rush to get everything back to the way that it was, or at least to move things forward in a way that we haven't really taken the time to say, okay, well, man, we just suffered through a pandemic and we're still kind of in it. Have we really sat and thought, okay, how has that changed me? How has that affected me? Is that for the better or for the worse? How do I deal with and pray through and meditate on the pain and the loss that I've had through the pandemic? I don't know that we do that. And so I think that's kind of like, people say the body keeps score. I think that's how our anxiety tends to come out when we don't give it an outlet.
I definitely agree with you, Jesse. I think there is this hesitation to lament what happened. And almost like if we look back at it, like it'll come back for us.
Yeah.
Don't poke the beast. Just leave it in the cave and that would be great.
Yeah.
And I guess I wonder what's in the cave. Like, if we did poke the beast, if we did draw it out, like, well, what's in there? Is it a treasure worth finding? And I think there is some fear of trying to figure out that. I work with people from all different professions and backgrounds, walks of faith, you name it. And this affected every single one of us. And then it affected us in ways that we still don't know. And are we willing to look at it? And my experience in my churches, the answer is not yet. In my office, the answer is, well, you're here, so buckle up.
Well, and we have some resources that we have offered to individuals or to groups from the leadership development team around lament and loss and healing and hope. And we'll put those in the show notes that might be helpful as a group, or an individual just wants to do some of that kind of spiritual work. That might be helpful resources. So we'll include that.
I was just going to say, I've even had conversations with people who have gone to therapy and then revisited that pain. And they're like, well, I'm not going back to therapy because that is not fun. And I'm like, but on the other end of that is so much healing, and you could leave all of those hurts behind, but it's one of those things you can't go around it. You have to go through it.
I think about for myself, after really confronting my anxiety in therapy and taking the time for it, I think back at myself and I think of like how much I would not want to go back to the person that I was, not because that person wasn't good and worthy, but because it was just exhausting. And I never realized how exhausted I was all the time until now I'm on this other side and can say, yeah, I get to do so much more and serve so much better because I'm just not tired all the time. And I think that in itself is a reward, but it does require, as a music therapist, I use music all the time in my sessions. And I really love this song by Johnny Swim called Let It Matter. And it talks about like, if it hurts, let it hurt. And, know your hurt is not in vain. Don't hide yourself from the horror because you're hurt today, but you're here tomorrow. And she talks about in the bridge, like, you've tried to run, but you know that the only way out is through. And I think music really provides that outlet and that language sometimes that, yeah, it would be a lot easier to run, but I've tried that and it's going to hurt, but there is grace in the process too of the forward and backward steps we may take. And no matter what, God is with us in it.
And then there are the country songs that you can just sing along with and feel better about too.
Johnny Swim is Americana. So, they're just one step over genre-wise.
So, Catherine, you mentioned, dealing with anxiety. And I remember around COVID specifically, I remember when I had started going to therapy, sanctuary counseling group as well, before the pandemic hit in 2019. And I remember when it did hit, things changed so rapidly that I feel like I just reverted back to my pre-therapy self and then had to kind of retrain myself again in some of the things that I had already learned. Is that something, it sounds like that's something that you see often. Is that so? And also, how can we be better prepared? Because these situations, unfortunately, are going to happen. These situations that cause us anxiety. Can we be more prepared, and how can we do that?
It can definitely happen. I've seen people do tremendous, growth through therapy and walk out of therapy really embracing a more authentic version of themselves. And then life happens and we go back to the way that we were because it's a little bit easier sometimes to be that way. I know for myself, you talked about how can we kind of catch ourselves or, know maybe when something's happening. I know for myself after, doing counseling for many years for my anxiety, the biggest thing I catch myself doing is I'm making lists. And not just lists, I'm making lists of another list, of a list that I also have somewhere else of a list. And that second that I make that second list of a list, I have this moment of like, wait a minute, am I solving my anxiety or am I falling back into those old habits that never got me anywhere? And what they did was really just give me a sense of like non-accomplishment, basically, because I never finished anything. And that impacted my own self-worth and self-value. And instead, throwing away that second list that I was just making, bringing my attention back to that first list and really asking myself, okay, what's bothering me here? What's unsolvable on this list? And let's start again. And for a lot of times with clients, in the last couple of sessions before they discharge from therapy, I talk to people about what are your red flag or your lightning rod kind of things. Like, let's know what are the things you never want to go back to. And if you do, it's not a failure. It is acknowledging that you're going back to a safe place, but we can push through that. We can push to a better place. And for some people, like myself, they start to acknowledge it and do it on their own. For some people, they come in and they check in with me and they say, all right, let's reset. How do we do it?
I'm very much like that too, where my therapist says it's obsessive compulsive personality disorder, that like planning things makes me feel better. So like when I get really frantic, I'm like, okay, I need to lay this out. And so I will make this intricate plan and then have no time to actually get to any steps in the plan because I've just like spent so much time making it so detailed.
So I wonder, Catherine, for people who are listening to this podcast, and maybe each of us contributes to this conversation, but kind of coping skills or response skills, things that we might do or that would be helpful to others when you are experiencing, when you can just feel the stress rising in your body. And I love how you said, you ask yourself some questions to try to pay attention to what's going on. I wonder what some other ways that we can respond to that sense in our lives and in our bodies.
There's a lot of different techniques for anxiety management. A lot of them you hear, meditation, deep breathing, prayer. These can all be really effective for emptying techniques of naming that sometimes something's staying on my mind that I need to be more still with, or I need to give up to God. One that I'm actually a huge proponent of is kinetic based, basically exercising your body. I have a lot of people that, they describe the tightness in their chest, the pain in the back of their neck or their shoulders. And I ask them, what would it feel like if we're going to sit, I've laid on the floor with my clients before, and I'm like, I just want us to put our arms out like a giant T, and I just want us to lay here and talk. What does it feel like? Does it feel like to dig into what does your body need? What does your body want? Let's go after it. If it's tight here, stretch it out. I picked up a lot of exercise and yoga when I was doing a lot of active treatment for my anxiety, and definitely know it had an impact. Some of the more cognitive techniques are the ones that I was saying that I use now a lot, and including with my clients. One is understanding what is in our control and out of our control. And sometimes I will almost draw like a T graph, So I've got this big list, what's in my control, and start kind of writing things down. What's out of my control? Well, they haven't answered my email back. I can't really control that. They'll see it, or it'll happen. And really staying focused on what is within my control. I see a lot of people that a lot of their anxiety is really caused, sadly, by things that take time, take other people, maybe an act of God. And those are things that we can't control, or we can't rush or push.
I was going to say, in a Richard Rohr devotion that I read one time, it was actually, I think, following his reflection, and then it was just a practice experience that it had at the bottom that I use sometimes. And that is just a visual image of putting the anxiety in a boat and watching the boat float down the river.
Mm-hmm.
And when I remember to do that, it can be really helpful just to have some kind of, letting go of it, even though it's all in my mind. But that was something I really appreciated from a suggestion he had.
I really love reflective prayer and those kind of practices that come from Richard Rohr as well. The boat is a really good metaphor. I have a lot of clients that like the idea of the river, the stream. Like, what if everything was just kind of floating past me? Like, what if nothing affected me and it just simply went by?
So as a pastor, I think about a lot of these things from a church perspective. We've talked a lot about, frankly, things that aren't listed in scripture as responses to our anxiety. You even mentioned yoga, which I've heard some people even reference the fact that yoga comes from a different religion. And so I think some people are a little weary of some of these practices. What would you say is the role of the church in this space?
I think the church plays a vital role in anxiety and in being able to talk about anxiety. I sometimes wonder if the prevalence of anxiety has gone up, or simply our willingness to talk about it and be okay with sharing it. I tell this to a lot of my clients who are teenagers. My first time ever talking to someone about my anxiety was in a middle school Bible study, being really, really nervous about an upcoming test. And my leader was, an amazing person. I looked up to them so much, but they didn't know what to do with me getting tearful talking about this test. And so they handed me the Bible and said, I want you to turn to Philippians 4:6, and it'll make everything better. And it just made me not willing to ever talk about it again in Bible study. And I think the role of the church is, this is the place that we can come broken, healed, anywhere in between, and be loved and accepted where we are. And I think the church plays an absolutely vital role in that. I think it's almost every single time that I go and I speak to a youth group on mental health, I think of how much like we're changing the chain of events that happened when I was in 6th grade to now getting to talk to these kids and share scripture and mental health with them and say, hey, these things don't exist in two different spheres. They exist together. I, tell my clients all the time, a lot of the times I see people that they come in and they are convinced that if they are anxious, then they're just not trusting God enough. They are anxious or faithful. They're exclusionary to each other. And I really, really encourage people to dig deep into the both and of that. You can be faithful and anxious. I can love Jesus and trust God's plan in my life and worry about tomorrow. And really relying, it's taught me by bringing those things together to talk to God about way more that happens in my life that I never did before. And I think the church can encourage that. How do we open the door to talking to each other in community as the body of Christ? And how do we also open the door to God of that? These are the things God wants to hear about. We are his children. And this is the things that matter.
I agree. I sometimes feel like it requires a little bit more of reading into the context of the scriptures instead of just reading the scriptures. I think if we just try to isolate scriptures instead of looking at the stories in front of us, thinking about the book of Lamentations, the fact that we have scripture that is just there to show us how the Israelites responded in a time of great anxiety, being taken over by another nation, and all of the Psalms that we have, where some of our Psalms say some pretty gruesome things, but it kind of opens us up to the opportunity to feel like we can say whatever to God, even realizing that Jesus himself in the garden, although he was praying for God to have God's will in his circumstance, he was still sweating blood and praying for God to have that cup pass from him. And so I'm really encouraged by your terminology there, the both and, in the ways that we view our anxiety and our faith, that we can hold both of those together like Jesus did. Also, though, from the perspective of a parent, especially I have 2 young children. My children are 4 and 2. I'm wondering also what the role of a parent is. We, as Kim mentioned earlier, some of our greatest anxieties comes from when we were really young children, not knowing how to deal with those things. Not that we do now, but how can we as parents play a role in that as well?
I think one of the greatest things that parents do, and I see so many parents do really well, is listen. And it may not feel like a big thing. It may seem super insignificant sometimes. But to be able to be validated as a child and, listen for the 100th time about this or that can make such a huge impact. We talk a lot about in counseling good enough parenting. You don't need to be the perfect parent to make really, really great children. The good enough is knowing that you're not going to get there every single time, but you're also going to admit when, I want to do over on that. I recently, talked to a good friend of mine with some young kids, and she said, I just didn't have the patience that day. It was just a really, really tough day for even me. And the look on, she said, her kid's face when she came in later and said, I'm sorry that I didn't listen to you about your day. Like, will you tell me now? And she said that all of a sudden her child lit up, talked, and then gave her this big hug and said, I love you so much, Mommy. And I think a lot of the times we forget in being parents, we get so worried about doing it so right that we realize that our kids are watching us, and a lot of the times feeding off of our own anxiety about getting it right. And so how do we let our kids know that I didn't do that the way that I wanted to, and that's okay? I'm going to try again.
Yeah, I love that story. as I think about parenting and the things that we've been talking about related to the church, it makes me think of the need that we all have, I think all humans have, for community. And when it comes to parenting, knowing that you're doing it in community with other people doing something similar, and or there are mentors and people who have gone before you to process with and to encourage you. I feel like that is a role that the church can play that you might not find in other parts of your life. And the opportunity for people to come together and to be vulnerable and to be honest about what's going on in their lives and the help that they might need or the friendship that they might need in the midst of that. I wonder, we've all been active in churches for most of our lives, all of our lives. Have you all had that kind of experience in the church or seen that kind of experience in the church? Maybe a story that you could share?
I'll say around community and encouragement. There are parts for me in therapy that are really like raw. So like I said, I've been doing therapy since 2019. Recently, we touched on a topic, something that happened in my past that I cried about. And I'm not a crier. And even thinking about it now, it's a really raw topic. But I was having a conversation with a friend in church yesterday about what my therapist told me that I needed to do, some difficult conversations that I needed to have with the folks that hurt me so deeply so long ago. And knowing that I had a friend from church in my corner who is praying for me, she gave me a hug, which was a hug at the right time, and just kind of encouraged me that, once I engaged in those conversations that I've been avoiding, I told her, I'm going to see my therapist on Monday. And so I know I have to have this conversation by Monday, but I'm pushing it off as much as I can because it just hurts so bad to think about and it hurts so bad to talk about. But, she reminded me, once you have this conversation, you're going to move forward being so free and you can begin your healing. And so for me, having a community of folks who I'm willing and able to be vulnerable with, who can help keep me accountable when I don't see my therapist until Monday, but also just to be there to encourage me and to remind me that I have people in my corner has been very helpful for me.
Thinking back to back to growing up in the church, and I was very active in the music ministry at my church. And I think about some of the people that I met during that time, especially when I was in high school. I'm thinking of this really, really tight-knit group of us. I mean, most of us don't live in this state anymore. We're spread out all over. And when Christmas time comes around and we're all kind of back in town because it's the holidays and we're here with our families, we're all at Summit Coffee. And it is that feeling that everyone knows, like when someone really looks at you and says, "How is it with your soul?" And I could say anything to them and they would say, "I got you." I think that's the kind of community that can come from church that on this topic is just so important, because these are the people that get to see you at your best and your worst. And then they see God through you. And I just think about, I don't get to see these people every day anymore. We've all grown up and, have families of our own, but I'm immediately transported back into that sense of community.
I think that's really helpful for leaders. We often have lay and clergy leaders listening to the podcast and just think about how do you create an environment and a culture within a congregation that develops people in a way to both feel like it's safe to be who you are and be vulnerable, and also to develop leaders and friends and Stephen ministers and all the different kinds of roles that people in the church can play as they offer friendship in those ways. Your stories are both beautiful. Thank you.
You've definitely given me a lot to think about. I'm thinking a friend of mine in one of my classes at Duke talked about how influential the verse, "Be still and know that I am God," has been for him, because sometimes just those words is all he said he needed when things start to get crazy and haywire. And he felt like like you said, like the difference between the things that are in our control and the things that are out of our control. And just to be still and know that God is God and that God is for you. And if God is for you, who could be against you? This has kind of been really helpful for him. And so I kind of did that too. I changed the background on my phone to say, be still and know, so that I can just quickly glance at that and remember God's got a plan for all of this. And so even though it's difficult now, God's still on the throne. God's still in control. So
speaking of music, the Fray has a good song called Be Still.
Yeah.
That if you're not familiar with it, it also.
I actually have, like, for my graduation from seminary, I had a really good family friend ask me if I could have a Bible verse on a pen, what would it be? And I said, be still and know. Every time I pick it up to write something or sign something, I think, like, all right, like I said, making those list of lists, that moment.
Okay, this is one list too many.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Catherine, for sharing your wisdom with us and for allowing us the space to enter into a really difficult conversation, but a conversation that is so needed. I hope that this conversation invites others to have their own conversations around their own personal anxiety and practices that they have. And we even encourage, everyone listening to the podcast to share in some way the practices that you've found to be most helpful in dealing with anxiety, and to share this podcast with anyone who you feel really needs to hear a word of encouragement around their anxiety as well. Catherine, we thank you so much, and we're so grateful for this time.
Thank you all.
Thank you for listening to Means of Grace, a podcast produced by the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church. We hope you enjoy listening to these podcasts and use them as a way to stay connected to our community. Remember to subscribe to Means of Grace for free on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please leave us an honest rating and a review. It helps others find this podcast. Follow the WNCC on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at WNCCUMC. Once again, that's at WNCCUMC. Means of Grace is produced by the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church and Andy Go of Gojo Studios.